Hi everyone, welcome. We will get going in just a couple of minutes. We'll just wait for a few more people to join. Thank you for joining us today, and we will get started very shortly. So hi everyone, welcome to the very first seminar hosted by Health Promotion International and ICARA. This very first webinar, we will be talking about conflicts of interest in public health and addiction research. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Professor Samantha Thomas. I'm a Professor of Public Health at Deakin University, and I'm also Editor-in-Chief of Health Promotion International. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to those of you who have joined us from many different parts of the world today. I know today has been quite a difficult day for many people, and perhaps more than anything, what today shows us is that we need to be even more unified in the face of some very powerful vested interests. I'm going to start today with an acknowledgement of country. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded land, skies and waterways on which we come together today. I'd like to pay our respects to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from today. And we acknowledge here in Australia that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. First of all, I'd like to just introduce you briefly to our editorial team at Health Promotion International. We have an incredible group of scholars who join us on the editorial team. This is a completely new team for Health Promotion International that we re-established in February 2023. And one of the things that we love about this team, not only is the diversity of team, but also that we have so many of our editorial team, our advisory board, and our editorial board who focus on the commercial and political determinants of health. And you'll hear some of our editorial board members today talking about conflicts of interest, particularly in relation to commercial determinants. So a little bit quickly before we begin about Health Promotion International, we are an Oxford University Press journal, and we would like to really thank Ed Amar and Kaylin Deary, who are on the call here today from OUP, who have been fantastic in supporting this webinar series and setting this up for us today. But as you can see, we have a very broad range of issues that are really important for our modern world and for the future health and well-being of our people and planet. And we would really encourage you to click on the QR code and really have a good look at HPI and see if this journal is relevant for you. I wanted to say a little bit about HPI and conflicts of interest. We are extremely proud at Health Promotion International that we have one of the, I think, the best policies around harmful industries, I think, of any academic journal. We decided very early on with this new editorial team that we would not accept research funded by the tobacco, alcohol, ultra-processed food, commercial gambling, arms, weapons, or fossil fuel industries, or organisations funded by these industries. We think that is incredibly important because these industries really should have no say in the decisions that are made about the health and well-being of our communities. We also have on our website bios of our board members, and we make sure that all members of our editorial teams disclose any interests on their bios at the HPI website. And we would really encourage other public health and health promotion journals to do the same. Before we move on, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Andrea Moen, who is president of ICARA and also a lecturer at Dundee University. Andy, I will hand over to you to say a few words about ICARA, and then we will start our webinar and talking about conflicts of interest.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha, and welcome everyone. So I'm the president of ICARA, which is the International Confederation of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drugs Research Associations. And we're really proud to be partnering with Health Promotion International. So just a little bit about ICARA. So we are an umbrella organization for research associations who focus on alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, as well as behavioral addictions. And really, our mission is to try to promote and support and enhance research in this field nationally and internationally. So we do have a deliberate focus in capacity building within and between member countries, and our aim really is to try to avoid duplication of effort when it comes to this research and helping to connect people across topics and disciplines. So we do have a special focus on conflicts of interest at ICARA. And a few years ago, we did put together these guidelines on management of relationships with organizations with vested interests. So if you're interested in taking a look at this guidance, you could please scan the QR code, which will take you to our ICARA website. We are looking to update these guidelines, but one of our key aims is to work with our members, our member organizations, as well as individual members to really try to understand more about these relationships and how they can best manage them. So just very quickly, this is our ICARA board. So we're very blessed to have a talented group of academics as well as practitioners from around the world as part of our board. And Professor Sam Thomas, as well as Professor Joel, who also sits on Health Promotion International, are also members of our board. So thanks very much, and I pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Andy. And Andy, I think, is off to teach. So we are very lucky to have you here. We can hear the students in the background, Andy, very enthusiastically hoping to get to class maybe.
Sorry about that.
It's totally fine. So I guess, first of all, why a webinar on conflicts of interest? So for those of us who work in the commercial determinants of health, we know how problematic it is when powerful vested interests become involved in academic research. And we are seeing this increasingly, not just in terms of funding of individual researchers, but also funding of universities and more broadly, scientific agendas. We thought that this was incredibly timely at Health Promotion International because we are incredibly concerned about the influence of harmful and health harming industries on scientific research, but also the problems that we see in relation to being transparent about those interests. We recognize at Health Promotion International that just being transparent about your conflicts of interest do not take those conflicts of interest away. And so what we wanted to do with this seminar today was to look at some of the issues surrounding conflicts of interest, look at some of the pros and cons of having declarations, but also then to suggest some way forward. At the end of the presentations, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and I would really encourage you to use the Q&A function that you should see beside you to ask questions throughout the presentations and beyond, and we will answer those as a group at the end of the presentations. We know that harmful industries influence the decisions that are made about the health and well-being of the community. We know that these are across different industries, and sometimes they are part of the public relations strategies of industries as well. But we also know that researchers have very different levels of opinions and engagement with these industries. We know industries like tobacco are pretty much off the table for many researchers, but others have very mixed views around a range of other industries. Some are happy to take funding from these industries. Some are happy to sit around the table with these industries. And this is what we think actually is the core of the problem in relation to conflicts of interest. For us as publishers, we feel with conflicts of interest that we are constantly playing what we call whack-a-mole. We see this phrase, nothing to declare, coming up from many of the people that submit to our journal, and you will see that as a conflict of interest declaration on many academic articles. But for us as editors, we have often found that people are not declaring conflicts of interest, and there is a very difficult conversation that then is had with our authors, sometimes which leads to us not accepting papers as well. So we want to start to think about how we declare, what we declare, and what this looks like in terms of our science moving forward. I'm now going to pass over to Dr. May Van Schalkwijk. Many of you will know her. May is a public health doctor and researcher working at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. May, I'm happy to pass over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Samantha. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to contribute to this very important webinar on a very pressing topic. As Samantha said, my name is May. I'm a public health doctor and researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I do research on the commercial determinants of health as part of a new group called the Commercial Determinants Research Group. In the interest of transparency, I would like to declare that my research was previously funded by the UK NIHR, and at present I'm fully funded as a public health doctor and researcher within the UK NHS. I've never received funding from health harming industries, and I'm currently a member of the editorial board for HPI, and I'm also a guest editor for the special edition on commercial determinants of health. I'm going to be giving a very brief scene-setting presentation, making the case for a much greater focus on public health, on conflicts of interest in public health and addictions research, and a paradigm shift in policy and practice responses to this. Fantastic, slide moved. I wanted to start by actually placing today's webinar topic within the wider context of the commercial determinants of health. And this is defined as the systems, practices, and pathways through which commercial actors drive health and inequity. And there's a substantial and growing body of evidence documenting a highly consistent playbook of practices adopted by commercial actors, particularly those that are harmful to health, as Samantha was saying, and these practices are used to protect their business interests, but that ultimately often undermine public health goals. And concerningly, such practices are often enabled by the very systems and pathways, the purpose of which is in their mission and their intended mission and purpose of which is protect and promote public health, with a key example being academic institutions and the scientific process. So indeed, the influencing or bending of science is a core practice within the corporate playbook, and different industries engage in the scientific process in different ways, depending on the context and the product or service they produce and promote. And I wanted to actually share this really important figure from a book by McGarity and Wagner on such practices, because I think it really captures what we're talking about. It captures so well the understanding that this type of influence occurs along the entire scientific process or pipeline, and that this can be thought of as a form of pollution or contamination that really influences the whole system, from how problems are observed and defined, right up to how they're researched, by whom, and to do what. Their work also helped capture the diverse forms that these practices can take, from shaping the evidence base and hiding of unfavorable research, to attacking and harassing researchers, a very underlooked aspect of this playbook, attacking those whose research is threatening to them, and also right up to spinning and packaging results to shape public knowledge and debate. And thanks to the brilliant work of scholars like Tess Legg and many others like Lisa Barrow and Alicia Fabre, who study industry scientific practices and the ways industry funding of research really bias the public health evidence base, we not only know the impacts such practices have on science and the production of knowledge, we also know why industries engage in them, which, to put very simply, is to maximize profit by fostering the production of industry-favorable research on the one hand, while minimizing and undermining the research that threatens their interests, creating an evidence base that allows them to either cast doubt on the harms of their products, frame the problem as one of personal responsibility, and ward off regulations, as well as promote the virtues of their products and gain approval for their widespread use. And it is this vision and use of science that exposes the fundamental conflicts of interest that arise. So many industries use evidence and science to advance their interests, which often do not align with public health. And as historians McCulloch and Tweedle once said of the US, British, and asbestos industries, whose funding and use of research distorted understanding of the harms associated with asbestos and with devastating consequences. They, and I quote, systematically used science against the poor and vulnerable to slow down research. They never used science to speed it up. But it is really imperative that we do not think that this is an issue of the past, something that happened in the context of harms associated with things like asbestos and tobacco, for example, and that lessons have been learned and that the academic process is somehow now protected from undue influence. It's also really essential to understand that influence does not need to be direct, and that partnerships and engagement with industry and the conflicts and interests that arise take different forms and exert their effects in different ways. And this can lead to, for example, the shaping of entire research agendas and problem framings, right up to reporting results and the provisions of recommendations. And we continue to see this playing out across multiple fields. For example, as you can see on the left, the pharmaceutical and baby food industries partner with and fund academia, which has created bodies of evidence that supposedly demonstrate the benefits of their products and extend their uses to treat conditions often actually created by these very same industries, while leaving the harms under-researched or downplayed. And the fossil fuel industry is funding academic institutions to shape research agendas on how to respond to the climate emergency. Then above that, we've got over 40 years of funding, predominantly from the gambling industry, has led to the creation of an international evidence base shaped by industry-favorable concepts like problem gambling, and that predominantly focuses on downstream interventions at the individual level. And there's a stark lack of robust evidence for public health interventions designed specifically to prevent gambling harm. And then in the field of alcohol studies, we see that systematic reviews undertaken by authors with histories of alcohol industry funding differ in important ways from those reviews conducted by authors without such history of alcohol industry funding. And importantly, these reviews are more likely to report evidence such as a cardioprotective effect of alcohol use. And finally, many scholars have revealed the ways that food industry funding of researchers and entire institutions has led to entire research agendas focused on micronutrients, for example, or physical inactivity, always deflecting from the role of harmful and conflicted food systems and the role of sugar and particular products and marketing strategies, for example. So in this way, industry influence of science and the conflicts of interest that arise as a result of this across so many fields is a major threat to public health globally. And alarm bells should be sounding, and much more action should be taken across sectors and contexts to address it. But why should alarm bells be ringing? I think it can be really helpful to just step back and look at this from a health systems perspective. And here I mean health systems in the broadest sense. So from healthcare to public health systems and public policies that influence health. And as captured quite usefully by the WHO Health Systems Framework, effective and equitable health systems rest on these 6 core building blocks or pillars. And I think two of which are seen as cross-cutting. And these are information. So this is including robust and reliable research on wider determinants of health and exposures to harmful products and practices, for example, and governance and leadership pillar. And so I think it's important that while acknowledging that in some contexts and institutions, important steps have been taken to address conflicts of interest, and it's really important that we understand we can learn so much from these initiatives, But overwhelmingly, industry influence of research and conflicts of interest that arise from this engagement continue to erode these two core pillars. And there is ongoing failure to collectively respond in a way that's commensurate to the magnitude and seriousness of this problem. Yet when it comes to other threats to our health systems, radical and previously unimaginable steps are taken to protect our health systems, as observed during the COVID-19 pandemic when, here in the UK, we were told to stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. But we're not seeing that same sense of urgency or recognition of the problem when it comes to conflicts of interest, as well as industry influence more broadly, and the undermining of public health and addictions research. So we need to ask, when are our health systems, including the research institutions that provide the knowledge that they rely on to keep people safe and promote health, going to collectively acknowledge the scale and impact of the problem associated with conflicts of interest, taking them as seriously as we do other threats to our health system? For example, I think we need to start seeing messages like this one: stay away from conflicted interests, protect science and the production of knowledge, save lives. And this needs to be accompanied by efforts to support health professionals, researchers, policymakers, and the public to respond in a way commensurate to the threat that conflicts of interest pose to our health systems and ultimately public health. And James and Adam are going to go into what this might actually involve. But before passing over to them, I wanted to conclude my talk by sharing two quotes, and I think these are very relevant to today's discussions. The first is a book from Ackerman and Leist, who, in the context of researching and in the context of discussing the challenges of researching and establishing the effects, health and environmental effects of pesticides and navigating all the vested interests involved in that, he stated, "Research is hard to fund, but easy to buy." So it's a very simple quote that captures, on the one hand, the challenges we face in securing funding for research that is actually required to protect public health, but how easily it can be bought in the pursuit of protecting corporate interests. And finally, the second quote is from Marx, who, based on his analysis of the drivers of the opioid crisis in the US, calls for a paradigm shift to a norm of separation and a questioning of the current paradigm that really sees partnership with industry, including between industry and academia, as essential and inherently beneficial. And he states, "Many proponents of corporate partnerships argue that we cannot afford to tackle the major challenges in public health without industry funding, including of research. But the opioid epidemic was fueled by the very relationships, and it has cost us trillions. Given the human and financial toll, we simply cannot afford to carry on doing business as usual in public health." And this is the key message I'd like to leave you with, that business as usual is failing to protect public health and addictions research, and ultimately public health, from the impacts of conflicts of interest, and things need to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, May, as always. And I can already see we've got questions coming through using the Q&A function. So please do use that to ask lots of questions. And thank you for those who have already put some questions into the chat. Our next presenter today, I guess, looks at some of these issues in practice. At HPI, we are incredibly supportive of early career researchers and PhD students who we think are some of our most incredible creative thinkers in academia. And so we'd like to welcome Dr. James Larkin, who's a postdoctoral researcher and honorary lecturer in RCSI at the University of Medicine and Health Sciences in Ireland. James, over to you.
Thanks a million, Samantha. Thanks for having me. So as Samantha was saying, I'm going to chat about whether reporting of conflicts of interest is an empty ritual. So usefully, May has given us an excellent account of why funding from industry creates a big conflict of interest and kind of undermines research and biases it, and then shifts the research landscape to favor industry narratives. Now, I think also on an intuitive level, we can kind of see if industry is funding something that relates to them, that's problematic and should be maybe avoided. If the tobacco industry maybe is funding something related to health research, we can intuitively see that that's somehow problematic and maybe should be avoided. And this latter part of it should be avoided, I suppose, is where this idea of reporting of conflicts of interest being an empty ritual. So industry has decided to, let's reframe the narrative. Instead of talking about avoiding the conflicts of interest, let's come up with an alternative solution. And maybe that alternative solution could be transparency. So if we say that reporting conflicts of interest solves those conflicts of interest, then that means we don't have to avoid conflicts of interest. We can keep funding the research that we want to, or we can keep funding the organizations that we want to, and reciprocally, or on the other side, those organizations can keep receiving the funding, and the cognitive dissonance, I suppose, that clash where you're thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, that gets resolved because the narrative that reporting these conflicts of interest solves it allows the funding to keep going. So to engage in my ritual, so my disclosure is that I'm a postdoctoral researcher in RCSI, University of Medicine and Health Science. My research primarily is pharmaceutical and medical device funding, and I don't receive any funding from those industries. However, I should point out that RCSI, the university I work in, does receive significant funding from the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. So, as I say, I'm going to focus a bit more on the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. So I should start by saying that, just because it's been transparency has been reframed as a solution doesn't mean that transparency isn't a key step toward a key step in the process that facilitates management of conflicts of interest. If we don't know about the conflicts of interest, then we can't manage them. We can't say restrict them or change how we deal with research or organizations who have conflicts of interest. So first off, to talk about industry and how they frame the narrative. So this is some documentation from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. And they place a very large emphasis in their documentation that transparency is a key principle in managing conflicts of interest in the National Health Service in Britain. And it also maintains patients' trust. So throughout this documentation, you see a disproportionate focus on transparency as a tool to manage conflicts of interest, and essentially no focus on other tools to manage conflicts of interest, i.e., like May pointed out, not taking funding from industry or excluding certain voices, as Samantha described for Health Promotion International's journal, not taking some money. And it's worth pointing out that you can see here that several non-governmental organizations and even governmental organizations such as the Welsh Government have endorsed this document by the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. So it's clear that this is a legitimization process. So the industry are reshaping the narrative to say that transparency solves the problem, and they're also engaging in a legitimization process. So I'll come back to the legitimization process now in a second. So an interesting recent example has happened in Britain where the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, him and his wife were found to, his wife, Lady Victoria Starmer, were found to be receiving funding from a donor for a range of things like clothes and other areas. Again, intuitively, this seemed problematic to anyone, looking on. It would maybe bias the Prime Minister in favour of policies that might favour someone like the donor, Lord Ali. But the way that Keir Starmer reframed things was to say it's important that rules were followed. They were very transparent about the funding they received and even proactive about declaring political donations. So it was using this tactic that we've seen from industry again and again to reframe it in order to legitimize the receipt of donations and then legitimize the conflict of interest. So then we've done some work in Ireland with a journalist looking at the company Novo Nordisk, who produce GLP-1 inhibitors, and we found that obesity experts in Ireland who were having significant influence on Irish policy related to these drugs were receiving lots of pointing out all the money they were receiving and how it was influencing their talking points and behavior. And there was a really interesting quote that the experts used to explain it. they said, we're not in the pockets of big pharma. That's why we have to be so transparent. So I thought that was really interesting, because it kind of says, if we'd something, if this was problematic, we'd be hiding it. The fact that we're open about it means it's a good thing, if anything. So it's this legitimization process, the idea that if you're transparent about it, it legitimizes it. It says this funding is A-OK. And we see this time and time again as narratives coming through from healthcare practitioners and healthcare organizations in receipt of industry funding. An interesting recent example, I was chatting to a doctor in a hospital where they were receiving very little money for their research, and they went to a meeting across the different departments, and someone from the nephrology department said, oh, if you're worried about research funding, you can get some from industry, and that solves a lot of the problems. There's huge shortfalls in government funding in this area, and they said, before, I know what you're thinking, industry funding is worrying, but don't worry, it's all very transparent, and it comes through an independent body. So again, these narratives that transparency legitimizes industry funding are being seen throughout the healthcare landscape, and you'll see them in other landscapes as well. So the intended benefits. So there's often said that sunshine is a disinfectant. So the idea, if we can see things, people will stop doing them. But I think, well, I'll come back to some of the evidence on it, but I think intuitively we can see that it can also act as a legitimization process. So it doesn't necessarily have that effect. Secondly, there's a claim that by being transparent, it allows the public and patients to decide for themselves. There's allegedly increased trust in the healthcare system. And then fourthly, it allows research and policymakers and others to highlight the issues. Now, some of these things are true. There would certainly be decreased trust if they were hiding the conflicts of interest. But the presence of the conflicts of interest necessarily decreases trust as well. It's important to point out, and that's rarely pointed out. And the fourth, I have a bit of a conflict of interest myself as someone who highlights these issues using the transparency registers. I think that's useful. However, it's not useful if we spend too much time talking about transparency and not enough time talking about management of conflicts of interest. So in terms of the downside, so transparency, certainly when it comes to the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, there's no evidence that transparency has reduced the numbers of conflicts of interest. If anything, there seems to be some evidence that it's increased. And if we move to the very last point there, that the transparency allows industry to learn from each other. So we see with the pharmaceutical and medical device industries that if we look at that there's research looking at their industry literature saying, oh, if we look at what this company has done, we can see they're targeting these types of healthcare organizations, and they're doing it for this product. Other healthcare organizations should consider similar practices. So if anything, it can create more conflicts of interest. So, as I've been saying throughout this, it allows industries and recipients to claim the problem is solved, transparency being a tool to legitimize the funding and avoid management. Another issue is that these are very difficult to interpret, particularly for public and patients. You see funding from this organization, that organization, and the other organization. You're thinking, what do I do with that? And you don't want to throw all the useful research, out when you see conflict of interest. So people get confused. There's also this interesting aspect of moral license and strategic exaggeration. The idea that, if someone's been transparent about this conflict of interest, then they might strategically exaggerate, say, oh, well, I want to counteract people's negative opinions, so I better just increase, bias myself in favor of, say, the findings I have, or and this can happen at an unconscious level in the context of moral license, subconscious level, and consciously in terms of strategic exaggeration. And then this happens on the other side. So if someone sees that you've disclosed, then someone watching the presentation sometimes thinks, oh, this person must be trustworthy, and therefore it undermines, I suppose, the idea of a conflict of interest being problematic. So just very briefly now, I should say that I believe that, I suppose, there's a disproportionate burden of evidence on those criticizing conflicts of interest, and I think there should be a greater burden of interest of those engaged in conflicts of interest. But just to say that, unfortunately, certainly when it comes to the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, the research showing some of the things I've shown in this last slide is somewhat limited, focused on small populations, sometimes of students, primarily based in the US. However, there's good work on industry statements and industry activities that kind of does show it, although they're prone to exaggeration as well. So it's just to highlight that. So as I was saying, that there's a disproportionate focus on transparency of conflicts of interest, and I again, give my own conflicts of interest statement, say that I'm vulnerable to that as well, and you see that in research, people focusing primarily on disclosure without talking about the complex processes of managing conflicts of interest, and this has risen from these medical device industry transparency databases. So just briefly to sum up why there's too much focus on transparency. Like, obviously it suits the industry, I've talked about that, and it suits those with conflicts of interest, but it also suits other people as well. It's quite complex. It's quite a complex and process to manage conflicts of interest. To say to restrict certain bodies, it can mean, I don't know why my slides keep. It can be quite a complex process to restrict or manage conflicts of interest, and it's just easier to use transparency. Say, okay, look, we were transparent. That means we can do whatever we want. And also, because there's certainly in the pharmaceutical medical device industry, because there's so much funding coming from the pharmaceutical medical device industry, it can also be hard to access, research or experts without accessing research and experts with conflicts of interest. So it leaves you at a loss as to what to do if you start excluding them. So it then becomes easier for you to say to yourself, oh, if transparency solves the problem, that kind of saves me a lot of hassle, and lets me answer questions or get experts if I can just ignore the management process when it comes to conflicts of interest. Sorry, I'm nearly there now, Samantha. Just briefly to say that transparency tools have been useful for us in highlighting conflicts of interest, and I've been part of a group that has restricted funding from industry as a result of our research on some of the transparency side of things. You can read more about that in the Health Action International blog there. And just to sum up, there's too much focus on transparency, and its usefulness is misrepresented, but nonetheless, transparency is necessary in order to manage conflicts of interest. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much, James. And if you haven't read any of James's research, I would really encourage you to do so. It's been really influential in shaping some of my own thinking, particularly around pharma. So some great research there, and we'll come back to James in the question and answer as well. Just quickly to say your questions are private, so we have lots coming in, but you won't be able to see those on your own screen. Now, what do we do about this? Professor Adam Dunn from the University of Sydney, who's Professor of Biomedical Informatics at Sydney. Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much. And yes, the questions coming in are looking very nice. So I would encourage everybody to put more in there as well, because they're great. Look, thanks, Samantha. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the kind introduction as well. I have what is the easy job, I guess, of trying to convince you that despite the challenges you've heard about already, that there's a new kind of a hope that we can manage conflicts of interest. I'm going to take you through a bit of the history of what we think is potentially a way forward, and hopefully explain to you and convince you that finally now is the right time. So, as is obligatory, it wouldn't be a conflict of interest talk without also including a declaration slide. And like some journals do, this is my declarations, less a set of conflicts of interest and more a flavor of who I am. And it kind of explains to you why you're going to expect to hear me talking about artificial intelligence and data quite a bit during this talk. The only thing on this list that is a declaration of a financial conflict of interest is my editorial role with MPJ Digital Medicine, and that may influence my perspective on the role of journals, journal editors, and managing conflicts of interest, and the kinds of tools that actually will make our jobs a little bit easier. So you've already heard that the conflict of interest disclosures, there's uncertain value in them, but I really wanted to re-emphasize this point and sort of re-say it in a different way, that it really is a key challenge in this area. I think this might also be part of the reason why many authors, many journals don't take disclosures very seriously, which can in turn make disclosures even less useful. What we know is that for biomedical research, 1 in 5 published articles describe a conflict of interest. 1 in 10 are missing any kind of a statement anywhere. And those that have a conflict of interest tend to be published in higher impact journals and can receive more attention online. The problem is that as a reader of a published article, it's hard to know what to do when you encounter one. Are you meant to throw the article out? Are you meant to be a bit more careful to look for issues like spin and outcome reporting bias? Or maybe you should trust it more because the authors must be trustworthy. They've disclosed their conflict of interest. Or maybe they're even more of an authority because they're good enough to get paid for it. Perhaps partly because we see such little downstream value in disclosure, we also see those same inconsistencies from journal to journal, from author to author. Disclosures often hard to find. They're often buried in places that we can't mine from data mining perspective, using standard data mining tools or things like web scraping. And what this means is that for meta researchers, the people who are investigating these things, if we want to investigate these patterns and find out about the impact of conflicts of interest on things like spin, things like certain conclusions or biases that affect how research is conducted, reported, or even how they decide what to investigate in the first place, it's super time consuming. So we have to be really prudent about targeting these analyses because of the amount of manual labor and extra work that it takes to make sense of these. So around 10 years ago now, I spent a lot more of my time doing these kinds of time-consuming studies, investigating conflict of interest disclosures, largely related to the pharmaceutical industry. And what I was trying to do was to uncover hidden patterns in research agendas and through networks of co-authorship. And anyway, long story short, they put a picture of this face and my pontification on what I think we should do with conflicts of interest in a journal called Nature. And look, I wasn't the first to suggest that we create standardized representations of disclosures. And following an Institutes of Medicine report, there was even a company that was creating software that could do this sort of thing for individual organizations like universities. Of course, this company in their software didn't include data mining, and they didn't set it up so that it could be made public. It was really just a way of keeping track of conflicts of interest in private. This was a long time ago, and we now have things like those transparency databases that you've heard about in the previous talk. But at the time, what I thought was desperately needed was an open registry of all authors' interests, where we could start off by mining as many declarations as we could, map them to individual authors based on their ORCID identifier, magically figure out how to disambiguate authors with the same names not linked to their ORCID, and then automatically standardize the information so it could be used as a repository of declarations with their timing associated with them, and give authors access to their own declarations so they could update them and fix them over time if they wanted to. And so that would give us a whole bunch of really useful tools, right? Publishers, authors, they could automatically produce a standardized statement. Journalists could check before they interview someone to talk about that fun new study about how pasta actually helps you lose weight, to find out in advance if they're getting paid by big pasta. And more importantly, the meta researchers could now actually do the job of tracking at scale areas of research such as individual treatments, medical conditions, where there are problematic levels of conflicts of interest, discrepancies in conclusions, spin, biases in research agendas, and all those other things that might manifest from the conflicts of interest that people hold. The problem was that we couldn't find funding for this, despite trying a whole bunch of different places. Probably this was partly because research integrity sleuthing wasn't anywhere near as sexy in the old days compared to what it is now, but also because data mining and natural language processing methods that we needed at the time would have required some, at the time, sophisticated new algorithms. And that kind of work is risky and it can take time. So, fast forward nearly a decade, and all of a sudden, the tools that we needed to invent back in 2016 are now available at our fingertips. The large language models that underpin ChatGPT and Claude and all the other tools are actually transformative. Take it from someone who's been doing AI for 20 years, they are transformative, not only in the way that they've been made available and easy for anyone to use, but because their capabilities are actually general enough and good enough that it doesn't take a year to build one bespoke model to solve one task. It now takes minutes. So I spent 5 minutes coming up with a prompt to ask GPT-01 to become an expert in assessing spin in the abstract and full text of published trials. I used an article about spin that Lisa Barrow was an author on, second mention for Lisa tonight. And I asked GPT-01 to become an expert. And then I took that expert and I pointed it at a published trial. What you can't read in the background of this slide, because it's a bit transparent, is the output of that. But this happened to be pointed at a trial about Ozempic. And GPT-01 systematically went through and assessed every aspect of the spin in the article and generated this long report, which I can then ask it to summarize and then grade. It's not perfect. Sometimes when I point it at different trials, it looks at the wrong article for some odd reason. But for a 5-minute job, it's pretty much as good as any previous attempt I've seen at automating the analysis of spin. But we're not here to talk about spin. So then I asked GPT-01 in the same conversation to find the financial conflicts of interest for the article. And without any additional guidance, it knew where to look in the article, and it had enough contextual knowledge to focus on Novo Nordisk, despite some of the authors in the trial having a very long list of other companies in their disclosures. You can even ask GPT-01 to explain why it focused on the company, and the response is exactly as expected. It responded that that's the developer of the drug, and it also explains how, because of that, they're the developer, it might influence the design of its trial and its reporting in relation to spin, which was the previous part of the conversation. Even better, again, without any additional guidance, I can also ask it to produce a sort of standardized list of disclosures for every author. It's easy enough to get it to look at the list at the bottom, often giving acronyms like RP, and then to map them back to their list of authors, and then to extract out those individual conflicts of interest per author and describing which of them were relevant to the trial. So what does it all mean? Well, the thing I wanted to build nearly 10 years ago, it's probably much, much easier to build right now. It wouldn't take years of machine learning development, and it's probably become something that we could prototype in 5 minutes, a couple of days, and test out easily and evaluate on a large data set in probably 6 to 12 months. Okay, so now we can use AI to solve these problems pretty quickly. So how could we actually help manage conflicts of interest? So this big question is, could we turn this into something that's actually useful for managing conflicts of interest? Well, let's take another look at some of the functions and the tools that could be built once we have something like the registry that I proposed back in 2016. So could we do it at scale? Well, first of all, it's a little bit expensive to run this kind of a model using cloud compute for all articles and all authors all at once. But it has been done. Once it's been done the first time, we would only need to run it for any newly published article, and it could be done in a kind of a focused way that focuses on areas of research that we think are especially important. So here are some of the practical tools that could be relatively easily developed right now based on what I showed you in the previous slides. We could automatically add a big red flag to articles where conflicts of interest may not have been properly disclosed for authors who've reported relevant interests elsewhere. We could add tools for journal editors and for publishers to automatically check authors against public information about their interests at submission time. We could reward good practice by indicating which journals are good at maintaining independence and don't have discrepancies in conclusions, and especially journals where open access fees are helping those kind of more biased manuscripts get published a little bit more often. And I'm guessing in terms of rewarding good practice, HPI would likely do very well on this scale. And then plus all those other things that I described earlier around producing standardized declarations for every author, kind of template that could populate and produce more standard descriptions of conflicts of interest across every journal, rather than having all of those heterogeneous versions of it across every different kind of journal ever. But most importantly is the ability to be able to monitor all published research and to be able to identify patterns that might indicate major problems in the research agendas or the kind of reporting in each topic. So I wish we had something like this when drugs like Tamiflu were being heavily marketed. That's the kind of era that I was in, looking at pharmaceutical industry influence. Would have made it so much easier for me to show some dodgy influence over the evidence base. I think I can probably talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer time, but I don't think this is likely to be perfectly feasible as a tool for more nuanced areas like gambling research, in places where disclosures are especially scant or they're obfuscated, and information about the true sources of funding are hidden in inaccessible places on the web. So it may not be the perfect solution for everything, but I think as a central repository, it would be a really smart one. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Adam. We are now going to ask our panel members to please pop their cameras and their mics back on. And we will start. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, and then Emeritus Professor Mike Daub is going to provide us some summary of the webinar today. There have been multiple people ask this question, so May, I might throw this over to you. It's something that we see at Health Promotion International a lot, where when we ask for complete declarations of interest, sometimes co-authors are very, very surprised about the declarations of their colleagues. We've had some questions specifically related to junior researchers and early career researchers. So how can PhD students and ECRs manage COIs in research, particularly when senior researchers or supervisors may not share the same views, and especially when junior researchers are more vulnerable to some pretty precarious funding relationships? May, do you want to take that one? And I'll ask our panel members to be quite quick with their responses so that we can get through a lot of these questions.
Thanks, Samantha, and thanks for the fantastic questions and my co-presenters who are just brilliant. I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I think just say out there that, you know, we could spend the rest of the day kind of discussing what to do for early career researchers and PhD students in particular. But just by way of a quick answer, I think it's really important to understand how pivotal junior researchers and PhD students are in that kind of cycle of creating how important that is to from a commercial determinants of health perspective, that we know that actually kind of building early relationships and funding people very early in their careers is actually part of creating an entire cohort of, you know, what will become industry friendly research and researchers. So I think I would flip it the other way and say, not what can PhD and ECRs do, what can we as seniors and academic institutions do for them, so that we stop this kind of cycle and careers that are often, you know, influenced from a very early stage.
And I guess it's about the whole ecosystem that sits around this as well, what we value in academic research. So again, some really good questions coming through, and some of these questions will be answered in some of the papers that we'll publish in our commercial determinants special issue, which is coming out in about mid-November. Just developing on that, a really important question, and one that we've been researching. I know that Professor Barbara Mintzes from the University of Sydney is on the call today, looking at transparency with government. One of the things that we have looked at very closely is the level of expectation for conflict of interest declarations and things like parliamentary inquiries, which in Australia are pretty few and far between in terms of kind of standard practice, in terms of declaring conflicts of interest, and in terms of government talking about how they've managed conflicts of interest in any policy recommendations that they have. James or Adam or May, do you want to respond to that? What about governments? What's their role in all of this? James, do you want to have a go at that, or May?
Sure, yeah. I think a lot of the same issues apply, and if anything, they're more important in those spaces. Like, you know, if you don't know what's happening, you know, the public can't judge, or journalists can't judge, you know, whether the information being provided is biased. And you know, at the very least, we need transparency, and we need to push for governance to manage it. You know, we saw it with the scandal here with Keir Starmer in England, and how something that big did start to shift the narrative and change things. So unfortunately, a lot of the times it takes some sort of scandal or something like that to really move the dial and change practice and policy.
And we have a question here specifically about gambling with these vague conflicts of interest, which I know May and I see all the time, being researchers that work in this area. But also what we are now starting to see in terms of conflict of interest declarations are these very, very long conflict of interest declarations, which seem to be declaring anything and everything, what you had for breakfast that day, who you met with, you know. And what happens then is that the thing that you're interested in is buried within a very, very long declaration. So one of the things things that we struggle with at HPI is kind of what should a conflict of interest declaration look like, and some of the things that are created, is it 3 years or 5 years or just related to that project? And so getting some standard parameters around that, I think, is really important. James, there is a very specific question about you, but I think it's for you, but I think it's a broader issue as well, is how did you get the Irish College of GPs to stop accepting industry funding, or what was one lesson you learned about that process?
Well, yeah, the big lesson I was getting involved with people who were central to the organization and really connected to the issues that GPs face, because it's really hard to wean yourself off industry funding. As May excellently pointed out, it's really hard to get funding for research, but much easier when you go down the industry route. So I suppose the key for us was connecting in with people, and they connected with me really, who were really connected to the organization, really connected to the issues, and then were legitimate voices in that space who people would listen to, and who were also willing to work really hard with no pay or income in return to try to make the change. So yeah, it's connecting.
No question for Adam, but just
maybe I can add to that a little bit. That there have been some nice studies that have shown that if you say no to pharmaceutical company influence within hospitals, at least, maybe not necessarily in other clinics, but in hospitals, that it can have a positive impact on the prescribing in those hospitals. And studies like that are, providing strong evidence of high quality interventions in practice should be useful. And I guess they should also be useful for influencing government decision making and the funding through public health purposes as well. Although I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the ability to use evidence to influence government.
Great answer, Adam. And just one for you, no question for Adam, but absolutely love your ideas. And so I think that's exciting. And it's one of those things about how can we use new technology to start to even visualize some of these things. Someone said, is there a way that we can start to visualize the connections? And I know from some of your work that you've started to do that as well. Maybe just a last question, and then we might just hand over to Professor Daub to sum up. I think this is really an important question. There are kind of two that are along similar lines, which is particularly about commercial determinants of health researchers whose funding sources might include a range of industries that support health harming industries. So things like management consultancy companies or pharmaceutical companies. What do we do about some of those broader structural influences at play? And then perhaps the last question, which links into that, is, what do we do with citing these reports which have these very, very large teams of authors on them, these big kind of global reports that come out? How can we be sure about the conflicts of interest statements that are embedded in the paper findings when there are very few of these big global reports that have very clear conflict of interest declarations from the cast of thousands? And perhaps just to say quickly that one of the problems that we have at HPI is we might be really diligent as publishers in requesting and requiring conflicts of interest declarations, but we do notice that those same authors then do not declare those conflicts of interest in other publications with other journals. So anyone kind of got any last thoughts about what do we do about those papers? Is this now some time for publishers to step up and start to really take this issue seriously so that we do have more transparency, even though that doesn't take the conflict of interest away? May, do you have a response to that?
Just two quick thoughts. I mean, I think given that so much is change, I think commercial determinants particularly is kind of it's such a rapidly emerging field. I think we do as a kind of as a field of study, but also practice and advocacy, is realizing that we almost need like a transition plan. This isn't going to flip overnight. What does it mean for people who are taking funding? How do we, we often talk about ending partnerships. So how's that going to happen? What does a transition into a more, as my talk was saying, what taking conflicts of interest more seriously? what is a pathway towards doing that? I think the other thing, and this maybe comes back to what you were talking about with having our own conflicts of interest or being funded, but I think this applies to conflicts of interest more generally, and with regards to those questions about early career researchers, is that so much of conflicts of interest is also about having what I would just say humility. So much of what I see is, yeah, I know that's a problem, but it doesn't happen to me. And I think we must remember this occurs to everyone. And Adam even said, his role as an editor might, he can't say for sure. It's important to recognize this isn't about them versus us. It affects everyone and all systems and institutions.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panel. I'm now going to pass over to Professor Mike Daub. I'm just going to unmute his camera so you can see him and unmute his mic so we can hear him. Professor Mike Daub will need no introduction to so many of you on the call today. He is the chair of the editorial boards at Health Promotion International. Mike, I will hand over to you for a final few words today.
Thanks for that, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking. And obviously I can't pay full justice to all the terrific presentations and observations we've heard. So just a few comments, which I hope will summarise and contextualise. In the spirit of full disclosure, as you said, I'm chair of the Health Promotion International Editorial Board, and that brings a concern that our policies and practices must be ethically sound, meet best practice requirements, and are clearly communicated and implemented. And I also, I think, have to declare an interest as someone who's been active in public health advocacy and research for more than 50 years, and during which time I've been frustrated over and again by the ways in which COI declarations are absent or inadequate, with only lip service for oversight, monitoring, and implementation. And I might just say my first experience of the way industry operates to try to influence science goes back over 50 years, in the days when I started working on tobacco at the Royal College of Physicians, and they would provide industry scientists with draft copies of their reports on tobacco for industry scientists to provide helpful comments. So I think we've actually come a long way since then. So just 5 quick points. First, thanks to the colleagues who've organised and spoken at this webinar, and those of you who've taken time to participate. It's encouraging. There's now clearly a growing interest in this area. We are seeing increasing exposure of poor practice, and we're also seeing increasing focus on the approaches needed to generate change. Second, it's all too true that addressing COIs is only one part of the broader approach we need. As James and all of you commented, we need a broader approach in countering the impacts of the commercial determinants of health. And as ever, there's no one single measure that will solve all our problems. But my experience is that the work various of you have done over the years is having an impact. We are seeing more by way of journals taking COIs more seriously. We are seeing authors who in earlier years wouldn't have dreamed of bothering with COIs, recognizing that they have to make some kind of declaration. And in a funny way, the sort of reactions that we're getting from industry and others to minimize the impact of COIs is an indicator that you're getting somewhere and they're feeling some heat. So we have seen a marked increase in the way that tobacco, alcohol, junk food, gambling, pharma are funding front groups or organizations with innocuous There's also work to be done in finding ways of bringing journal reviewers into play. It's enormously frustrating as a reviewer that because it's all blinded, you don't know who the authors are, so you can't comment on whether they've declared their interests appropriately. And of course, there's some resistance. There'll always be resistance to get tougher on all of this. But if we can engage support from leaders and the editorial and research communities, that shouldn't be an impossible target, especially as we've heard with the advent of AI. Fourth quick point is that while we're moving in these directions, we do need to keep exposing those who knowingly and willfully seek to omit or obscure reference to funding sources, particularly from harmful industries. So we should be in no doubt that further research and action on COIs is an important aspect of our work on health promotion broadly, and we need to keep talking up this issue. I'd like to thank all those who've made this event happen, the organizations involved, the HPI Journal and ICARA, the people who put a lot of time into organizing it, including, of course, Sam Thomas and our colleagues at the Journal, and in our publisher, the Oxford University Press. Thanks especially to our speakers, and again to all of you for participating. And from the HPI perspective, I hope that you will all stay involved and active in this area through research, journals, publications, and advocacy. And whatever else, it's a topical day to say this, whatever else may be going on in our world, we have to make sure that we remain, if anything, even more alert to the need for integrity in public health research.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. A special thank you to our panel members, and we hope that you join us for our next webinar early in 2025. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye from the HPI and ICARA teams.